Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. I should say you're analyzing with Jimmy today. What we're going to do today is understand Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, which hopefully you've been reading with Jimmy. In the words of a great philosopher, holy moly. Where do you start after reading this kind of novel, which is more about philosophy than a story? It's not what you've been used to reading with Jimmy, is it? No, this was a little different. Hopefully you stuck with me. What really happens in this book? Did you find it disturbing? Boring? Meaningful? What? Email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Did what the narrator do to Lisa disturb you? Now, if you didn't read it with Jimmy, you don't know what I'm talking about, but hopefully you did. Did you finish reading it with Jimmy, or have you jumped to this analysis? Well, if you jump to this analysis, I'd like you to go back and read the story and then read this analysis. But if you read the story and now you're reading the analysis, I think you should go back and reread the book again with me. Why? Well, it's a classic, and while you can do that, read and reread and analyze with any of the classics on my website, Dostoevsky's novels require rereading, perhaps more than others. And this is because Dostoevsky's books are more philosophy than just stories. You know, Albert Camus said, if you want to be a philosopher nowadays, he's dead now, of course, he said, write a story, write a novel. Don't write philosophy, because if you try to read philosophy like Kant or Schopenhauer, it's tough stuff. It's good to read, but it's philosophy, and Dostoevsky's stories are actually philosophical. So what makes this unique is that its structure, the structure of the story, mirrors real life. What does that mean? Well, it's disjointed. It's disjointed, right? It's not clean. Life isn't clean. Is it? Life isn't neat and tidy. It's messy. And neither is this guy's thinking, which is really, really messy. And that's part of the problem and challenge of reading Notes from Underground. Because when you think about it, what it means to be a human being, that is, you are thinking about why you do what you do. Now, most people don't know why they do what they do, or they think they know why they do what they do. But this narrator, this underground man, not only knows why he does what he does, he explains it to all of us for our benefit, right? So without him, we wouldn't really know another person's point of view, because we don't run around with glass heads, right? So you don't know what people are really thinking. But this guy we do, because he recorded it in his diary. And while we read to learn how others lead their lives and how to lead our own, that's Jimmy's rule, right? Especially classics. It also means learning by negative example. I mean, do you really want to be like this guy? We're going to talk about this guy a lot. The central core, or one of the central themes, you'll find in Notes from Underground, is his encounter with Lisa and his inability to connect with another human being. This guy is just can't do it. We're going to talk a lot about that, about the inability to connect with people, because connecting with people is like life. It's difficult. You don't know. Do you trust people? My wife tells me, Jim, you trust people too much. And I said, well, I don't know how to trust 80%. You're either in or you're not. And what is trust? What does that mean? Does this narrator trust anybody? Even though he's talking to himself in his diary, we have the opportunity to get inside his head, right? That's what we're doing when we read him. And that's something we can't do with others. So it's as good as an opportunity to find out a little about others and about yourself. And, you won't find another way to do that. You read classics, but this is pretty special. For example, why do you do what you do? Why do you work? Why do you why do you go on vacations to a certain area? Why do you love your parents or not love your? Why do you do what you do? The narrator tells us he works simply to have enough to feed himself and to eat. So why do you work? Are you satisfied with your work? What is work? Why do you have or not have friends? The narrator tells us he doesn't want to have friends because he's made a conscious decision not to have friends, i.e., he moved away so as not to be close to them. Who are your friends? Do you, as the narrator suggests, tell your friends some things and don't tell them other things? And don't tell yourself still other things? You know what I'm saying, all right? What is a friend, anyway? There's a great Maupassant short story on my website, The Two Friends. You should read it. Why do you love whom you love? Do you love? Are you loved? The narrator tells us why he can't love anyone. He comes right out and admits it. He's too busy inside his head with himself. What is love? Have you thought about it? Have you felt it, lost it, gained it? You can see by these questions how profound this book really is. I mean, think about it. We're getting into a guy's head and he's not confessing, but he's writing about what's inside his head for all of us to review, to think about. So Notes from Underground is a marvelous story about a person who thinks and writes his thoughts down. Do you do that? You should. My wife was just on a trip to visit her sister and throughout the week. And I was telling her, you should have kept a journal. She goes, I should have. She won't remember everything that happened. Sharing what it may strike you as BS. Now, when he's writing this down, if you started out with me, I had to give you a jump start on the analysis because sharing some of what he's saying sounds like BS, doesn't it? But he's sharing it with us. It's a novel about, most of all, action versus thinking. There's your clue. It's a novel about what his servants call the narrator. He's a madman. You remember that scene with Apollon where he was just going crazy, holding his 7 rubles hostage? Or maybe it's just about being a human being. We'll have to find out. The central question to ask yourself is if the narrator, is he nuts? Is he mad? I mean, he goes on and on and on, sometimes about nothing much, but mostly about nothing much. Or does he? He magnifies incidents, almost like making mountains out of molehills. You're going to hear a lot of that here, right? He doesn't he do that? A little shove, a little look. He makes mountains out of molehills. And you've heard that before. So if you say the narrator is crazy, by the way, he's unnamed for a reason, right? We never learn his name. If you say he's crazy, then reading what he wrote gives us insight into madness, doesn't it? It's like if you read Guy de Maupassant's The Horla or Nikolai Gogol's The Diary of a Madman. You get inside a person's head who's nuts. If you say this guy's nuts, I don't think he's nuts. But if you say he's not mad, then what he wrote gives you an insight into, quote, normal. Jimmy, what I read there is not normal. This guy is bonkers. Well, you could believe that. You could believe that. But if you don't, I'll give you an example. If you don't believe for 1 second that there's people out there like this, you better look again. I assure you. Oh, wait, maybe we're all a little mad. Can someone who is mad write something like this? I'm going to read this. Everything he means man, mankind, man, in the universal sense. Everything man does is not done by his willing it, but is done itself by the laws of nature. Consequently, we have only to discover these laws of nature, and man will no longer have to answer for his actions. And life will become exceedingly easy for him. All human actions will then, of course, be tabulated according to these natural laws. Is that a madman writing that? Because he talks a lot about mathematical certainty in this novel, doesn't he? That's the first part, it's philosophy. So he's arguing about certainty and freedom, and that's a pretty profound concept. You'll find that throughout literature, classical literature. Are we really free, or are we determinism? Are we determined? Are we just a bunch of chemicals and we can't help ourselves, so it doesn't really matter what we do because it's not me doing it anyway? Do you understand how profound that is? Which is why I don't think he's nuts. He may act nuts, but I don't think he's nuts. He doesn't want to be a piano key. And so he does things, as he says, out of spite. We're going to talk a lot about spite. But he doesn't want to be a piano key. He wants to do things out of spite. Why? Because he can. Or what about this? The worst of it is, look at it which way one will, it still turns out that I was always the most to blame in everything. Do you think a madman admits this, that he's the most to blame? In everything. In everything, he's the guy to blame. Who takes that responsibility? And what is it most humiliating of all is to blame for no fault of my own, but, so to say, through the laws of nature. In the first place, to blame because I am cleverer than any of the people surrounding me. Then he puts this little parenthesis there. I have always considered myself cleverer than any of the people surrounding me. And sometimes, would you believe, who's he talking to? Remember those mysterious gentlemen or himself? Have been positively ashamed of it. At any rate, I have all my life, as it were, turned my eyes away, and I never could look people straight in the face. That's an interesting comment. We talked about this in looking at people when you talk to them in other analysis. So he's never been able to look at people. Do madmen think like this? I mean, he certainly takes himself pretty seriously. Does a madman take the blame for everything? Especially since he doesn't believe it is the laws of nature, but he himself that does what he does. In other words, he does it out of spite. I'm proving to you I have a free will. If I want to, I'm going to hurt myself. I'm going to hurt you. Don't forget he was a clerk, right? He's certainly different, but maybe not so much different because as the story is about difference, real difference between thinking and acting. Thinking, and all of us do that, don't we? Don't we do that? We think and then we act, or we act and then we think. We're always doing that. That's the process. Sometimes don't you act without thinking? Why did I do that? Don't you do that? And sometimes don't you think without acting? How many times have you told yourself after acting, why the hell did I do that? Or how many times have you lost an opportunity because you couldn't resolve your thinking about it? Should have, would have, could have. You've heard all that, haven't you? Shoulda, woulda, coulda. Then why didn't you? Notes from Underground is a novel about a narrator who cannot break out from himself and decides to write his experiences down. It's kind of a catharsis that Aristotle talked about. We're going to talk about that again today. But before we start the analysis, I mean, we already started, I want to explain Mr. Maslow. Remember Abraham Maslow? We've talked about him in other places. He's got this pyramid, right, of self-actualization, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You start with the physiological, you proceed to safety, belonging, esteem. In other words, these are the steps you move towards self-actualization. What is that? That's becoming the best version of yourself. That's where you're actualizing yourself. You're just living. You're everything you're capable of becoming. It's the highest level of psychological development. Pardon me. So what does that mean? Well, if you're hungry here, you're not really worried about your safety. You gotta feed yourself, and then you worry about safety. Once you feel safe, you can start belonging, perhaps. And you can immediately see that, well, he works to eat. Does he feel safe? He's threatened every time he takes a walk, right? Or is he? And he doesn't really belong, does he? Does he have a good self-esteem? I don't think so. So he's either operating here or he's not. This pyramid has nothing to do with him. Why people do what they do. This is why they do what they do. They do things because they're hungry, physiological, right? I got to feel warm. I turn the air conditioning on. I want to feel safe. So, I got to prepare myself. I buy a slingshot, whatever. I want to belong. I want to be loved and loved. And then self-esteem. I got to have some self-esteem. I got to believe. And in this model, self-actualization is the highest. It's your true potential. And when you're operating there, all these other needs have been satisfied. That's why when I teach the internet, I always say, once you get up in the morning and you plug yourself into the internet, this is what you're doing. You're self-actualizing. What do you mean, Jimmy? I eat a piece of fruit when I'm on the internet. That's okay. That's okay. But you're you're doing things mentally, right? You're looking for answers, solutions. Whatever you're doing on the internet, you're being yourself, your true potential. Right? Got it? Let's look at this narrator in this book. Narrator doesn't really operate here. We talked about that. He's safe unless he himself follows the officer and tries to bump him. He doesn't belong anywhere, does he? He lives underground in his hole, in his room. So he doesn't belong. And he has no self-esteem. He continually belittle. He thinks he's really clever. He's very smart, but he doesn't show it, does he? When he tries to show it, like when he had his dinner with his friends, what does he do? He paces up and back. He doesn't talk to them unless they talk about Shakespeare. You remember that? So Jimmy thinks he's operating here. He's really, what is he doing? This is his true potential. He cannot be anything but what we read in his notes. That's where he is. Well, I don't believe that, Jim. Well, send me an email. Jimmy at Reading with Jimmy. If self-actualization is the highest, the motivation to become the best version of yourself, in a sense, the narrator in this book is trying to become the best version of himself. And you're going to say, which isn't much, right? I mean, what is this guy? So what is his self? What is this self? Fortunately, he tells you in the first couple of sentences what his self is comprised of. Remember? I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased. Who talks like that? He comes right out. I told you when you begin this novel, story, anything, play, the first part, the first paragraph, the first few lines are very important. He comes right out and he's writing his notes to himself, and we're eavesdropping. He's the first person narrator inside the story. That he's sick, spiteful, and unattractive. I don't know how you would describe yourself, but I don't know if I was sick and spiteful and unattractive, I would want to tell anybody. But he's telling himself. So that's really the best version of himself. He's not going to get any better, is he? And if you read this book with Jimmy, 8 parts, you're going to see how sick and spiteful and unattractive this guy is. I'm almost tempted to call him a horrible human being, aren't you? But is he really horrible? Is he horrible, or is he pathetic and stupid? Let's hold our judgments, because after all, we read classics to learn how others lead their life and how to lead ours. Though in this case, it's probably how not to lead our life. The main point is to recognize that there are people like this in the world. If you don't believe that, look around again. You don't know any sick people, spiteful people. You know what spite is? We're going to talk about that. Ugly people. Unattractive doesn't necessarily mean physically ugly. It could be mentally ugly, right? And that includes sometimes ourselves, although we don't want to admit that. Well, Jimmy, how do you know that? You sound like you had experience with being spiteful. We all have. Being unattractive. We all have. Being sick. We all have. You might not like. Remember, when he talks about being sick, what he says, he doesn't go to the doctor. He doesn't want to go to the doctor. Just believes he's sick. You might not like it or agree with what Jimmy just said about self-act, but you can't deny that this guy, this narrator, is satisfied with the way he is because all of his actions prove it. He likes to suffer in his head, doesn't he? He likes to suffer a lot. Everything bothers this guy. The slightest, oh my God. This is why examining action and thought is critical to understanding this guy. It's actually critical to understanding all of us. I asked someone the other day, do you live in your head? And there was this pregnant pause because I don't know if he knew what I was talking about, but we all live in our head. We have thoughts. And he talks about people who don't have thoughts. He calls them simpletons, right? We all have thoughts. The question is, do we take those thoughts into action, or does the actions we take lead to thoughts? Well, it goes both ways. Why do you do what you do is the central question to ask, and we're going to be especially if you're going to operate at the tip of that pyramid in self-act, you got to understand what you do. That's why I'm saying he's up there. He's self-actualizing. You might not like what he's actualizing to himself. You might like this guy. I don't like him. But he's doing it. He knows himself extremely well, perhaps too well. So with that background, let's get started with this book. Let's start with Aristotle. However, we'll quickly find out this book does not follow the rules. Remember Aristotle? Tragedy has 6 elements: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song, of which the first 2 are primary: plot, character. The most important of the tragedy is plot, the representation of human action. But what is human action in this story? What is the plot? Can you summarize the plot? It doesn't really seem to have one, does it? It's got 2 parts. First part is a little philosophy, and the second part are some episodes from 20 years ago. He's writing when he's 40. It's a diary, and it's first-person narration, so the plot takes place entirely in the narrator's head, which is important to understanding the story. Remember, he can't get out of his head, so we stay in his head, and we look around his head. And when he describes in the second part some of the quote-unquote adventures he has, right? We want to understand that those adventures are really a result of his thought processes. The structure of the novel mirrors life itself. It's sort of like a stream of consciousness. There's no set pattern. There's no beginning, middle. Well, Jimmy, we all die. Of course we do. So you're born, you live, and you die. That's life, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end. But if you take that big pattern, that pattern of being born, living, and dying, your consciousness, when you're thinking about it, for example, you don't think in punctuation, you just sprue things out, right? That's what he does in part 1. He just starts talking, and you want to shoot yourself, right? But you don't. If you keep reading it, he's presenting his philosophy. And in the second part, episodes that have shaped his philosophy. So what is the plot? Well, it doesn't really have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's just got some philosophy mixed in with some episodes of his life that tell you what? About him. They reveal him, his self. Right? The plot is basically a revelation of the narrator. Who he is, why he does what he does. It's kind of like he's confessing. So, according to Aristotle, plots are simple or complex. Did you find notes complex or simple? In complex plots, the protagonist usually undergoes what we noted in footnote 2, which is really catharsis. This word right here, catharsis. It's purging of the emotions of pity and fear. When readers read or people watch plays, they have catharsis. They have pity for the character and fear. Those two things. It's an emotional reaction to the story. Did you have an emotional reaction to the story? I certainly did, and I've read this book at least 5 times. And every time I do, I have emotional reactions. I couldn't sleep. I can't sleep when I read Dostoevsky. In complex plots, right, pity and fear, did this happen to the narrator? To you? Did he change? Some people write that he never changes, but he changed. He continually swayed. We'll talk about that. How did you feel when you read this, right? What did happen to that narrator? That's really an interesting question. I'm taking a sip of water. An unusual plot for an unusual narrator. Unlike our traditional definition of what Aristotle says tragedy is, Notes from Underground doesn't follow conventional plot. While there is action in the second part, the first part is largely a discussion. It's about philosophy. Is man logical? The second section has some adventures that the narrator experienced when he was 20 years younger, but now he's 40. And writing notes, don't forget. So in fact, the book's structure reflects one of the main themes, that the narrator just can't seem to connect with anyone. He's trying to. In writing notes, he's trying to connect with himself. Even though I can't do this, I can't. There is no logical reason to his narration, right? There's no logic or reason to his narration. He's the first-person narrator in the story. So don't forget, being the first and third-person narrators, there's a difference. He's subject to being human. He could be lying to us. This could all be fabrication, is it? I don't think so. Maybe he's bending the truth sometimes, maybe. But the way this is written in this diary narration, you can tell. He insists he's telling the truth. Truth appears throughout the narration. Note when he's on the sofa with Lisa with his face buried in the pillows. But the trouble was that the hysterics could not go on forever. And I am writing the lonesome truth. Lying face downwards on the sofa with my face thrust into my nasty leather pillow, I began by degrees to be aware of a faraway, involuntary, but irresistible feeling that it would be awkward now for me to raise my head and look Lisa straight in the face. Remember, he told us he doesn't like to look at anybody? So he's always watching himself, isn't he? And when he does that, he actually tells us he's doing that. I don't think he's lying. It's important to realize, too, that the book is divided into 1/3 philosophy, 2/3 episodes, and money seems to always weave its way through the narration. So the author's note, Dostoevsky's note, author's note, this is part of the novel. You remember it? Let's review it. This actually appears before the notes. The author, Dostoevsky, this is the narrator. The author of the diary, the narrator, and the diary are imaginary. Dostoevsky tells us, this is all imaginary. Nevertheless, it's clear such persons as the writer of these notes not only may, but positively must exist in our society when we consider the circumstances in the midst of which our society is formed. I, the author, Dostoevsky, have tried to expose to the view of the public more distinctly than commonly done one of the characters of the recent past. He, the narrator, is one of the representatives of a generation still living. In this fragment entitled Underground, it's a fragment. That's why you have no beginning, middle, end. This person introduces himself and his views, and as it were, tries to explain the causes owing to which he has made his appearance and was bound to make his appearance in our midst. And then in the second fragment, there are added the actual notes of this person concerning certain events in his life. That's pretty clear, right? What we're going to read, isn't it? So part one. This first section is intense, fragmented monologue by the anonymous narrator. Just look at the opening lines as we have done in the study of our classical literature. We read this. However, I know nothing at all about my disease, and I do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it, and I never have, though I have a respect for medicine and doctors. Think about that. I don't want to say he's confessing, but he's kind of... Besides, I'm extremely superstitious. Remember, he thinks he's really, really smart. Are smart people superstitious? What is superstition, right? You believe in ghosts and things. I'm superstitious sufficiently to respect medicine. Anyway, I am well educated enough not to be superstitious, but I'm superstitious. No, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite. I'm not going to do it. That you probably will not understand. You see, I'm not going to consult a doctor, but you're probably not going to understand why I won't consult a doctor out of spite. Well, I understand it, though. And of course, I can't explain who it is precisely I'm mortifying, in this case by my spite. I am perfectly well aware that I cannot pay out the doctors by not consulting them. I know better than anyone that by all of this, I am only injuring myself and no one else. But still, I don't consult the doctor. If I don't consult the doctor, it's from spite. My liver is bad. Well, let it get worse. Now, if you stopped reading after that paragraph, Jimmy understands why, but you missed a really good story. We learn a lot about this guy in the first paragraph, don't we? And many people make a decision to keep reading or not based on these few words. Well, that's a huge mistake for any classic to stop reading, because Dostoevsky, unlike any other writer, will bring us deep into our own psychology. Just take a look at what this guy writes, right? Can you go back and reread more? But more importantly, have you ever met anyone like this in your entire life? Maybe you've sensed someone like this, but actually met someone like this? And how do you know? You've been you've seen bureaucrats, and I'm sure that some behave like him and they grind their teeth at you because they have the power to do so. You know what I'm talking about. Here's an example. I remember when I was first graduated and I applied to be a teacher in Chicago, they would only give me a temporary teaching certificate because I didn't have a course on my transcript called library science. All right, that's like a half a credit course. I had a 4.9 average out of 5 in English, and in fact, all my grades. I was a smart kid. So I assured the bureaucrat that I knew how to use a library, which is what library science is all about. The bureaucrat said, sorry, the transcripts have to say library science. Sorry about the misspelling. You'll have a year to come back for a permanent certificate, but you can teach in the meantime. Nothing I said would change their mind. Nothing. I tried every type of logic. I said, I can tell you what I read in this course. Anyway, I ended up teaching in private schools, never went back for my permanent teaching certificate. So it's not the same thing, but it's kind of the same thing. He was a bureaucrat and he took pleasure in having power over people. This book is about power too. We can talk about that. I didn't really cover it in the analysis a lot, but I'll bring it up from time to time. So our narrator is a sick, spiteful, unattractive. He's superstitious, and he can't explain who he's mortifying in this case. Despite his education, he's a mass of contradictions, or is he? We find out in this part he's 40 years old, former government clerk in St. Petersburg, Russia, and that he worked solely for having something to eat. And when he inherited 6,000 rubles, that's a lot of money, and then he immediately retired from the service and settled down into his corner. Note, I used to live in this corner before, but now I've settled down in it, and my room is a wretched, horrid one, in the outskirts of town, and my servant is an old countrywoman, ill-natured from stupidity. He really talks down to a lot of people. In this section, he argues against reasoning, particularly human nature that can be perfected through reason is impossible. Consider what he wrote. The impossible means the stone wall. What stone wall? Why, of course, the laws of nature, the deductions of natural science, mathematics. And as soon as they prove to you, for instance, that you are descended from a monkey, then it is no use scowling. Just accept the fact. And when they prove to you that in reality one drop of your own fat must be dearer to you than 100,000 of your fellow creatures, and that this conclusion is the final solution of all so-called virtues and duties and all such prejudices and fancies, well, then you have to just accept it. There is no help for it, for twice two is the law of nature, of mathematics. Try refuting that. Upon my word, they will shout at you. It is no use protesting. It is a case of twice two makes four. Nature does not ask your permission. She has nothing to do with your wishes. And whether you like nature's laws or not, dislike them, you are bound to accept her nature as she is. And consequently, all her conclusions, a wall, you see, is a wall. And so on and on and on. I'm not going to be reconciled to it simply because it is a stone wall. And I have not the strength to burst through the wall, as though such a stone wall really were a consolation and really did contain some word of consolation, simply because it is true that twice two makes four. Oh, the absurdities. You see how he's reasoning here? On. How much better is it to understand it all, to recognize it all, the impossibilities and that stone wall? Not to be reconciled to one of those impossibilities if it disgusts you. This is logical, right? We're not going to reread it again here. You could go back and reread it, but basically he's arguing laws of nature, mathematics, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's a bit of juggling, a card sharper's trick that is simply a mess and not no knowing what and no knowing who. But in spite of all these uncertainties and juggling, what is he talking? Who is he talking to? What is he talking about? He's talking to himself. And every now and then you'll hear the word gentleman, like he's a lawyer in court. There is no doubt about that this is tough reading because it's philosophy. And if you've read people like Kant, who are tougher than this, my philosophy teacher used to say, Kant is tough. Well, philosophers are tough, but this guy is tough for another reason. He's a character in a story. He's in the story. He's not like Thoreau writing in the essay Civil Disobedience, which is on this website. Pardon me. What is this guy talking about? That's the important question if you're going to understand the second part of the book, where the action is. So let's take a quick look at some of these answers. Besides things called the laws of nature, so that everything man does is not by his willing it, but is done by the laws of nature. So you have no free will. Consequently, we have only to discover the laws of nature. This is what we read before, and have the answers to it, and everything will be easy. All human actions will then be tabulated according to the laws, mathematically, like tables of logarithms up to 108,000, and entered in an index. And better still, there would be published certain edifying works on the nature of encyclopedic lexicons, in which everything will be clearly calculated. See, there's mathematical certainty. So the narrator is arguing against mathematical certainty and against the exactness of 2 times 2. Man is not a math formula. Remember that. Unless you believe you're a math formula and you're not going to take responsibility for anything, you can blame the chemical makeup, right, of your body. Mathematical certainty is something insufferable. Really? I think it is. Twice 2 makes 4 seems to me simply a piece of insolence. Twice 2 makes 4 is a hurt coxcomb who stands with arms akimbo, barring your path and spitting. He's trying to personify the math. I admit that twice 2 makes 4 is an excellent thing, but if we are to give everything to its due, twice 2 makes 5 is sometimes a very charming thing too. Now, recently I learned that mathematicians make up numbers. Did you know that? I can recommend the book for you to read that. He will launch a curse upon the world, and only man can curse. The universal man may be his curse alone. He will attain his object, etc. That he is not a piano key. If you say that all this can be calculated and tabulated, the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop. He writes long sentences, doesn't he? And reason would reassert itself, that man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. I believe in it, that the answer for it, for the whole work of man, really seems to consist in nothing but proving to himself every minute that he's not a piano key. I'm not a piano key. It may be at the cost of his skin. It may be cannibalism. And now you start saying, what is he talking about? Well, he wants to prove to you that it's not a matter of math, that you have free will, that you can eat people if you want to. You're not a Dahmer, right? And this being so, can one help being tempted to rejoice that it has not yet come off, and that desire still depends on something we don't know? As far as my personal opinion is concerned, to care only for well-being seems positively ill-bred. Forget about well-being. Whether it's good or bad, it's sometimes very pleasant to smash things. One of my favorite statements of all time. I don't care if it's good or bad. Sometimes I just like to throw stuff. Not that I throw stuff. I hold no brief for suffering, nor for well-being either. I am standing for my caprice, for his whim, and for its being guaranteed to me when necessary. Suffering would be out of place in vaudevilles, for example. If you were at vaudeville, which is, you know what vaudeville is, right? Look it up. It's, crazy stuff, throwing pies and people, vaudeville. Suffering would be out of place. For instance, I know that in the Palace of Crystal, the ideal utopia, it is unthinkable. The suffering shouldn't be here. Suffering means doubt, negation. And what would be the good of a Palace of Crystal if there could be any doubt about the Palace of Crystal? And yet, I think man will never renounce real suffering. He's never going to renounce destruction and chaos. Why? Because suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. There's a book called The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Talks about the Eloi and the Morlock when the guy goes back in the time machine. It's a movie, famous movie, a couple of versions. There's also a great book. And in that book, when he goes back to the future, or actually goes forward to the future, he meets the Eloi, right, who don't suffer. They just kind of live at the top. And the Morlocks who come up at night and steal the Eloi to eat them. Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. You remember when he's talking about moaning with a toothache? When you're suffering, that's when you're conscious. It's the origin of consciousness. If you never suffer, you're really never a conscious human being. You're just floating through life. There's something to this. Though I did lay it down at the beginning that consciousness is the greatest misfortune of man, and yet I know that man prizes consciousness and would not give it up for any satisfaction. Consciousness is infinitely superior to twice two makes four. Being conscious, being aware. Once you have mathematical certainty, there is nothing left to do or understand. Would you agree with that? I would. There will be nothing left but to bottle up your five senses and plunge into contemplation. But if you stick to consciousness, even though the same result is attained, you can at least flog yourself at times. And that will, at any rate, liven you up. Reactionary as it is, corporal punishment is better than nothing. I told that to a friend who told me the object of her would be great if she could just wake up and plug herself into the internet and just think. That's a strong statement, right? Because thinking is very different than reality. It's not reality. Social media, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to tell you this, is not reality. It's not reality. Well, Jimmy, how can you say that? It's just text like this. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's a way of communication, just like this novel is. But it's not reality. What this guy's talking about with consciousness, superior to mathematics, right? There's a lot to think about here. We could spend a whole 2 days on this. It's really a philosophical treatise attacking reason, or what many call rationalism. He rebels against that idea that humans act because of self-interest or according to logic. Instead, he argues that humans act irrationally. Do you agree with that? Do you think everybody's rational and logical and the world is beautiful? Do you believe that? If you do, then really you better reread this thing about 10 times because it's not true. If the world were rational and logical, the stock market would be predictable, and it's not. They're not predictable. I wish they were, but they're not. Simply to assert their free will, sometimes it's nice to just break things, right? He criticizes scientific determinism, the idea that human nature follows fixed laws, and the notion that utopian society is possible. Throughout the section, he presents himself as hyper-conscious. He's hyper-conscious, overanalyze everything, doesn't he? And thought to the point of paralysis. You overanalyze, you freeze. His self-awareness becomes more of a form of torture if you read this carefully, and he actually enjoys that torture. In part 2, we get some insights into how he turned out this way from some of the episodes in his life. We call this a flashback. He's going back 20 years now and writing down what happened to him because obviously he has a good memory. So this section provides a series of chapters from the narrator's past, all of which relate to his failure to connect with others, and thus alienation from others. He's alienated. For example, the dinner party with his old schoolmates. You remember that? He despises them, but he desperately wants to impress them, kind of forces himself on them. He's socially awkward. What does he do when he's at that dinner? He paces for hours, up and back, up and back. His fixation on a duel with the officer, who he observes for years because the officer ignored him and refused to step aside. In a meaningless act of defiance, he later bumps into the officer, but is left feeling empty. Nothing happened. In fact, once before that, he fell down and the officer just stepped over him, not noticing him. And then there's the episode of his servant where he was withholding the 7 rubles. And then the episode with Lisa, the prostitute, who's central. And he initially tries to grind his teeth at her, delivering a speech about her tragic future as a prostitute. But then later, he starts to feel something, a genuine emotion for her. And then instead of, going with the emotion, he starts to lose his spite. But then he checks himself and becomes even more cruel. And you'll have to figure out why he gave her his address. But you see on display his inability to accept kindness, to being open, to make himself vulnerable. His choice to retreat underground exposes his inability to form any kind of meaningful human relationship, right? The novel ends on an unfinished note, reinforcing the novel's lack of structure. So tragedy has been defining. So what's the story really about, ladies and gentlemen? What the heck is going on? Well, not that I always do this, but I want to give you another thing to think about that Dostoevsky wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, which I hope we'll read one day if it's not here already. Quote, "The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to such a point that he can't distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so he loses all respect for himself and for others. And having no respect, he ceases to love. And in order to distract himself without love, he gives away to passions, coarse pleasures, and he sinks to bestiality and his vices, and all of this from continually lying to other men and to himself. And the man who lies to himself can be more easily offended than anyone else." You know, it's sometimes very pleasant to take offense, isn't it? A man may know that nobody has insulted him, but he has invented the insult for himself. He's lied and exaggerated to make it picturesque, and he's caught at a word, or he exaggerated, making a mountain out of a molehill, and he knows that himself he will be the first to take offense, and he will revel in his resentment till he will revel in his resentment until he feels great pleasure in it, and so he will pass to genuine vindictiveness. What do you think? What do you think? Doesn't that describe our narrator to a T? Doesn't it? He lies to himself. His existence is about making mountains out of molehills. That's how he describes his living. The fact is, Dostoevsky's book is one of the most important, complex philosophical novels that you'll ever read. You just won't do it. And while you don't need to know what existentialism is, which is, he's the precursor to existentialism, it helps to know what existentialism is. So interestingly, when you ask Google what existentialism is, AI doesn't kick in. That's interesting. Or maybe it's kicking in now, but it didn't kick in when I wrote this analysis. Instead, Google gives you the definition and a bunch of links, one of which says, existentialism is a philosophical theory or approach which emphasizes the existence of the individual as a free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of the will. Well, that kind of fits what he is, or should be. Definitions are continued in one of the drop-downs. Existentialism is the philosophical belief that we are all responsible for creating purpose and meaning in our lives. Our individual purpose and meaning is not given to us by gods, governments, teachers, or authorities. We give it to ourselves. And I want to dwell on this philosophy for a moment, if I may. But we're going to pause there, and I want you to come back for another analysis to continue this, because we're on page 15 of 32. We're halfway through. If I continue, I'm afraid that you won't be here. No, I'm kidding. Let's divide it into two, and then maybe we'll come back and finish it. But I'm going to pause this recording for a moment. I'm back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jimmy, and you're reading the analysis of a very complex story, Notes from Underground. And we left off, we were going to talk a little bit about a philosophy called existentialism, which emerged after World War I. We can read about the war, horrible war. The philosophy itself was developed was that life is absurd. The people were in trench warfare, they were killing each other, so the existentialists said, this is stupid, life is absurd, we should kill ourselves. suffering, killing, torture. The war is full of bad actors. Nothing makes sense. Let's just kill ourselves. That's the absurd world, right? So existentialism used Sisyphus. I'm not saying you should kill yourself. It's not, even though the world's absurd, don't do it. Existentialism used Sisyphus as an example of what they are talking about. Sisyphus was a king that Hades, the god of the underworld, punished. When Sisyphus cheated death twice. He didn't go down there twice. Hades condemned Sisyphus, listen to this, roll a rock, boulder up the hill, only to have it roll back down when he neared the top. In other words, he never got to the top. Every time he got close to the top, the damn rock would roll back down, and you have to go back down and roll it back up. So repeating this action for eternity, and so the existentialists locked onto that image, specifically Albert Camus, and he said, this is what life is all about. You roll the rock, and you never get to the top, right? Well, it's not true. It's because sometimes people do get to the top, but you got to really understand that the joy of living is not getting to the top. The joy of living is rolling the rock. The existentialists said that the myth showcased the absurdity where individuals are condemned to perform meaningless tasks, that life lacks inherent meaning. Humans must create their own purpose in the face of absurdity. You have to define life. You're the one who has to define this. Define life. You know, why do you do what you do? Why do you roll the rock? Or you just give up rolling the rock? Don't give up. The concept is highlighted by Camus' interpretation, where he argues despite the futility of Sisyphus' task. Isn't that futile? You roll, you never get there. Try again, but you never get there. You have to think Sisyphus is happy by finding meaning in the struggle. In other words, you figure out what your rock is, you're rolling, and then you just enjoy it. In other words, you live. It's the exact kind of thing, opposite, or it is the thing that this narrator is doing. What's his rock? What is the rock that the narrator is rolling? He cannot connect to people. No matter how he tries, if he does try anymore, he can't do it. He can't do it. So he retreats underground. So we're responsible for creating our purpose or meaning. Now, I know that Jimmy has told you repeatedly you shouldn't bring anything from the outside to interpret what you're reading, and that you should utilize the facts of the classic to prove your point. But in this case, the points happen to point to this philosophy. And most the philosophers in this category give Dostoevsky credit for being the first with this kind of thinking. In other words, in this novel is existential philosophy, rolling the rock, the absurd. Isn't this guy kind of an absurd character? I mean, what the hell does he do? Right? He's a clerk. He belittles people. He's he freaks out at the littlest thing. Right? By the way, Dostoevsky wasn't the first. This philosophy that life is absurd has been around for a long time. Hamlet, which Jimmy reads on this website, had a famous speech. To be or not to be? That's the question. Well, to be or not to be is an existential question, right? Am I going to be or not be? And it's best expressed, you won't hear it expressed any better, and you have to read the speech to understand what he's talking about. But it is basically, should I live or should I not? It is self-actualization. When you're doing that self-actualization, you've already answered this question. You're being all you can be. Not just because you joined the army, but you're being all you can be. You're living every moment to its fullest. You understand? Is this narrator, living every moment to his fullest? Well, in his head, he may be. I mean, he spends years stalking that officer, right? Perhaps more important, if you decide to be, what exactly does that mean? Why do you do what you do? Does it mean torturing people like our narrator? Does it mean torturing yourself, helping people? Does this guy have any idea what torture really is? Is it worse to suffer mentally or physically? What do you think? Is mental torture worse than physical torture? What do you think? What is life all about anyway? You see, why this novel, if you read it properly, has a profound and irresistible consequences, which is to think about why you do what you do. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, this book is not for everyone. So if you stop here and you go back to Go and Do Not Collect $200, whatever, that's okay. It took me years to read Dostoevsky. I remember starting it in high school. I said, what the hell am I reading? I couldn't understand a word. Of course, I started with the wrong book. Even this book, it's not for everybody. There is no shame if you can't read it now. But I'm telling you, when you can read it, you should read it, and you'll enjoy it. It'll teach you a lot. Every moment of this guy's life is his focus. That's all he's focused on is him. He lives in his head. He exaggerates each of the moments of reality when he confronts them. And as you saw when he stalked the officer, his treatment of his friends, everything is taking place inside his head and put around by reality of a dinner with his friends, of Lisa. His whole narration is a diary, is an expose of his real feelings, providing us insights to study, to think about, and do what I always said, find out how others live to lead our lives better. And a couple more things about this philosophical novel. Notes from Underground is about freedom. It's about freedom to do what you want to do when you want to do it. You're not just chemicals. You're not just chemicals, right? Do you have a free will? Do you do what you want? Well, Jimmy, I don't want to go to work. Well, don't go. Well, I got to eat. Well, then go. You see what I'm saying? The Underground Man rejects the idea that human behavior is logical. He's right, isn't he? Human behavior is not logical. Look at history. So how crazy is this guy really? Who among us doesn't act in our own interests? Right? Well, I know a mother would give her life for his child, perhaps a father would, right? So you're giving up. But who? Most of the time, it's our self-interests, isn't it? It's about what we want, what I want. No, it's not. It's not about you. It is, but it's not. Oh, I'm full of contradictions. And before you say, well, I help a lot of people, Jimmy, what does that really mean, you help a lot of people? This book is studying power. And in the narrator's case, powerlessness. This guy's powerless. I mean, look at all the time he devotes to bumping into the officer. For heaven's sakes, just challenge him to a duel and be done with it. As much as he tries, he can't get outside of himself to relate to anybody. He's too logical. Despite him saying, the world, it's not logical. He's logical. Or is he? He attacks the notion of he's too logical. He thinks so long about things. If I do this and I do that, and then when it comes to execution, what? You remember what happened on the bridge, right? The officer steps over him the first time. He trips. And then when he finally bumps him, I showed him. And the officer probably didn't even notice him. He attacks the notion of utopia in society through rational. You can't create it. He talks about it as the Crystal Palace. But isn't he right? You can't create, no matter how we try. Mankind's been around a long time, and there is no such thing as life is messy. Man is not a math phone. The word utopia was from Sir Thomas More for his Latin book, Utopia. It's an ideal society that doesn't exist in reality. This book is about reality and illusion, action and thought. What are your thoughts? Do they translate into reality? Society and its institutions treat all citizens equally in the utopia. But have you seen anything like that recently? I have a friend, a former friend, when I said, what countries do you, I admire China. He admires China. Well, that's great. Why? He said, well, because they're disciplined. There's a dictator who dictates to them and they all listen to the dictator. Well, there was a book about called 1984. And how did that work out? You should read that book. Well, Jimmy, this guy lives in his head and that's all he does is read books. Well, that's right. And his problem is that he can't break out from his head. Dostoevsky also said that books are sometimes more real than real life itself. Why? Because you'll never meet a guy like this. And maybe you will. But most of you will not meet a guy like this who comes right out and tells you he's spiteful, he's sick, and he's an ass. He hurts people. He takes pleasure in hurting people. And he admits it to himself in this diary. You're not going to find anybody that says that. You'll see it, but nobody's going to admit that to you in the secret recesses of their heart. So this is a wonderful opportunity to study a guy like this, right? Well, Jimmy, this is just a book. It's not real. Is that true? What is reality? Should we talk about that one day? He's inside his head most of the time, just like you are. You're inside your head right now as I'm talking to you, if you're still listening. Hopefully you are. And you're inside your head. You're taking in my words and saying, what the hell is this guy talking about? I'm talking about living, trying to connect to people. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This guy just can't belong. He's not part of, he's just not part. He can't be part. He wants to be part, but he can't be part. Humans are simply rational. They're not rational. They act against their best interest just to prove they're free. I'll show you is a common thing with this guy, isn't it? I'll show you. Once again, he's right. Don't people act like, I'll show you. I'll show you. And then you get in trouble. Don't we act sometimes like that? It's fine. Free will and self-destruction. Some analysts say underground man deliberately sabotages his own happiness. Well, that's not true. I encourage you to go on Google, read all the analysis you can if you can, but basically forget all the analysis, including mine. But I think this is a good one. Of course I do. It's fine. But read analysis only after you've read the story. And remember, what I'm trying to do to you is prove from the story itself why I believe what I believe, that this guy is a jerk, but he's a kind of like a pathetic jerk. He's pathetic. He's a mean man. He's a mean man. Psychologically, this guy is very, very, very mean, right? How do you deal with a mean? So I'm surprised no one in this book popped the guy, right? This is not true because he hurts himself because he can hurt himself. He tortures himself. He tortures other people because he can. He believes by doing that is free. Or is his chemical composition telling him that? He takes pleasure in hurting people and hurting himself. So ironically, he's happy being unhappy. You understand that? Well, Jimmy, that's a contradiction. Is it? Have you met unhappy people? Boy, that Joan is always unhappy. She's just always unhappy. Did you ever wonder about that? Why she's always unhappy or he's always unhappy? Because they think they're happy being unhappy. That's what the suggestion is here. Because who the hell wants to be unhappy? What makes you happy as opposed to unhappy? There's a lot of unhappiness. As Sister George said once, there's too much unhappiness in the world, right? So what does it mean to be happy? That's another story. You know people like this? I certainly do. If he claims that people were given a utopian society, let's say they created you, they would destroy it and just give to prove they're free. That's where the great flogging quote, which we talked about, right? Even if you're perfect, you're going to flog yourself. It's like, I have to feel something. You remember when he talks about the toothache? So the need for struggle and control, power. Every social interaction this guy does, he turns everything in a battle for dominance. He's obsessed with bumping into the officer with his friends. I've got to dominate. This internal struggle is captured in his narration. You can see it, the way he writes, what he writes about. He's confused. He's hurting. And his struggle with himself inside his head prevents him from being natural. We're going to talk about that in a moment, about a pitcher throwing a baseball. So it's a matter of thinking versus action. Does the underground man change? Is there catharsis? Does he undergo a change? And lots of analysis will tell you that he doesn't change. He doesn't change. He starts out in part one as a mixed up guy. In part two, he's a mixed up guy. He kind of stagnates. A lot of analysis. He doesn't develop. But that's not true. What do you mean, Jimmy? Well, if you read with Jimmy, this narrator is changing continually and repeatedly. He's trying to prove he's not a math formula. He's struggling. There's conflict going on in him all the time. He's in conflict. Well, if you don't change, right, you're not in order to change, you got to be in conflict. So he does change, not always for the better. And while he admits to he's spiteful in the beginning, spite happens to be his prime motivation. Why? Because I'm going to prove to you I'm free. I'm free. So he swings back and forth between feelings of spite and the opposite, which are feelings of affection and malevolence. You think he wants to be liked? Of course he does. By his friends? Of course he does. By Lisa? Of course he does. But every time there's this expression of benevolence and affection, I can't do it. I can't take it, he says. And I'm going to show you I can't do it. I'm going to be an ass. Just because I can be an ass. Wow. Let me highlight. Wow. So what is spite? Let's talk about that for a minute. Google says spite is a desire to hurt, annoy, or offend. The operative word is desire in what Google tells us. The desire to do this. You're consciously want to do this. Because if you hurt someone, it may be unintentional, right? So if it's unintentional, is there a desire behind hurting, annoying, or offending? Do you always hurt because you're spiteful? Oh, geez, I didn't mean to do that. If you sincerely made a mistake, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to say that. You argue with your spouse or your loved one and you say something. Oh, no, I didn't mean to do that. But you offended them. Were you doing it out of spite or did it just anger? Is anger spite? What about annoying people? Sometimes I repeat a phrase over and over again and my wife says, shut up. Am I being spiteful? I don't think I am. Maybe sometimes I don't even know I'm doing it. But once she says, stop it, if I did it again, then that would be spiteful, right? To annoy her. If you know something you do bothers someone, do you do it anyway? If so, why? Well, you're being spiteful. That's probably spite. And sometimes you should experiment with being spiteful. No, don't do it. Desire implies a conscious decision, which this guy is. He's very conscious of what he does, why he does what he does. And the evidence is throughout the underground man, right? The notes from Underground. Pick up any section, reread it, and you're going to see the narrator is always watching himself, and always he decides to be spiteful. I'll be spiteful. His very existence about grinding teeth. He goes, So let's probe this spite a little bit. He's totally aware of what he's doing around him, but it's not always capable of action. At least actions like we might define them. So his actions are really not actions. From the beginning, he recognizes his own character. And some people call it flaws in his character, but I don't want you to say that. Well, Jimmy, he's obviously flawed. I mean, the guy's nuts. No. Hold your judgment. The absurdity of his condition, but he chooses to remain underground. His condition is isolation. He doesn't want to be, right? But yet he's He's got what they call approach avoidance conflict. He wants to be with people, but he doesn't want to be with people. He wants to love, but he doesn't want to love. It's approach avoidance. Because remember the billiard room scene. Can I repeat that? One night as I was passing a tavern, I saw through a lighted window some gentlemen fighting with billiard cues, and I saw one of them thrown out of the window. At other times, I should have felt very much disgusted. At other times. But I was in such a mood at the time. Remember, he's recollecting this from 20 years ago. That I actually envied the gentleman being thrown out of the window. And I envied him so much that I even went into the tavern and to the billiard room. What is envy? So did you ever envy a guy being thrown out of a window? Did you ever envy anybody? So this narrator is telling us this. This is an unbelievable admission. I was walking by, I saw a guy thrown through the window, and I envied that guy, and I went into the billiard room. Perhaps I thought, I'll have a fight too, and they'll throw me out of the window. That's one of the most important statements in this book to teach you about this guy's character. I'm going to force a fight perhaps and also get thrown. I want to feel something. I was not drunk, but what is one to do? Depression will drive a man to such hysteria. There's a key. He's depressed. Is he depressed? Why is he depressed? You never thought of that, did you? Nothing happened. Nothing happened. It seemed that I was not even equal to being thrown out of a window, and so I went away without having my fight. An officer put me in my place from the first moment. I was standing by the billiard table, and in my ignorance, I was blocking up the way, and the officer wanted to pass. So he took me by the shoulders, and without a word, without a warning, without an explanation, he moved me from where I was standing to another spot, and he passed by as though he had not noticed me. I could have forgiven blows, but I could not forgive his having moved me without noticing me. Sorry. Poor guy. Can you imagine? He's so depressed, he just wants to be thrown through a window. Can any of you listening to this oblige this guy, please? He says he was treated like a fly and that this officer he stalks for several years, right? Remember? So his refusing to integrate into society is a conscious act of rebellion against the no. Now, think about it for a moment. He goes into the billiard room. Why didn't he just pick up a cue and start fighting? What was he waiting for? Somebody to hit him? So his refusing to integrate into society is a conscious act of rebellion against predictable, rational world. People fight. And he just wants to feel. That's part of the issue here, right? He doesn't feel anything. He lives in his head. He thinks he feels something, and he certainly acts it out sometimes. Remember the hysterics he goes into? And by the way, doesn't he treat everyone else like a fly? Did you notice that? But look at what insults him too, and ask yourself if were you ever treated like a fly? Do you know a person do you treat a person like a fly? Here's a story. A bank president once asked me, why don't you want people to know that you own a business? And I said, well, because then they would treat me differently, which is true. And I want them to treat me like they do any other Tom, Dick, or Harry. He said, well, I want everyone to know that I'm the bank president. And I said, well, of course, I know you do. But then you're going to miss out on a lot of insights about people. Undercover Boss came to mind years later, but I never watched it. But fame is a dangerous thing. When people know who you are and what you are treated very differently. Wouldn't you agree? Just think about how his friends treat him. They know what he is. He's a pathetic, smart idiot, right? He's kind of like a sick, whatever. He's pathetic. So they treat him like that. When he meets the boys for dinner at first, they're wary because he kind of invited himself, and they thought maybe he was different. But then they end up ignoring him just like a fly. This poor, pathetic creature. So he experiments with relationship, but fails to establish anything except with himself. That's the sad story here. Think about his friends. It was almost a year since I had seen Simonov, Farfetchkin, all the rest. He hasn't seen him in a year. I had a number of schoolfellows in Petersburg, but I did not associate with them and had given up nodding to them in the street. People would nod in recognition, right? I believe I had transferred into the department I was in simply to avoid their company, to cut off any and all connections with my hateful childhood. And the narrator's intentions with Lisa represent a moment of possible relationship, as did the moments when he joined his friends. But he can't help himself from falling back into his underground spiteful hole. He hates people and actually hates himself. We read in this novel about someone in constant conflict with himself. Most of you are not in constant conflict with yourself. Sometimes you get into conflict with yourself. Maybe, if you're honest, maybe not. Why do you do what you do? Why do you do what you do? For example, when Lisa shows him compassion, he has a chance to make a human connection, but his spitefulness makes him torture her, right? He ends up torturing her again, right? And he knows he's doing it, but he does it anyway. So this back and forth, this changing, notching, is what this book is all about. How many times have you said, I'm going to change, and then you fall back into what you are and you have been? It takes a lot of determination and willpower to change if you don't like what you are. Most people don't even know why they do what they do or what they are. That's why this is a profound book. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not for everybody. Chapter 5 has a lot in it to understand this guy. So check it out with me. Can a man who attempts to find enjoyment in the very feeling of his own degradation have a spark of respect for himself? That's a question he asks. Can I respect myself if I'm enjoying my own degradation? He enjoys his spitefulness. He enjoys what he is. What is self-respect? That's a central question. Does he respect himself? What is Google says self-respect is pride and confidence in yourself, a feeling you're behaving with honor and dignity. And Google also says you show self-respect by not putting yourself down. You don't criticize yourself and you don't demean others. But that's all this guy does, doesn't he? Have you ever said, boy, was I stupid? I know I have. And does this mean you don't have self-respect? Well, it depends on what you're stupid, what you did that was stupid. You see, this is complicated. There's a saying, you do unto others as you have them do unto you. You know, that's biblical, right? Well, that's about the best definition of self-respect Jimmy ever came across. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it means that you treat people the way you want to be treated. Isn't this what goes on in this story? Huh? Doesn't he treat people like flies because he is they treat him like a fly? So how does this rule work? Well, he believes treat him like a fly, so he treats everyone else like a fly. He believes people don't see him, so he doesn't really see other people. Remember, he can't look them in the eye. But do they really treat him like a fly? Look at that dinner scene carefully again. Look at Lisa's scene. Look at those scenes again, and you'll see whenever he says, I feel something, he's feeling a glimmer of what it means to be human. You read the story, judge for yourself. And when he went to dinner with his friends, why did he behave like that? They were almost trying to reach out to him. Why didn't one of them just pop him? Because he was obviously obnoxious. It was like they kind of know what he is anyway, right? He's just a fly, so we'll just brush him off. And don't forget, I want to say that this movie was The Fly, the movie The Fly, but it's not. And don't forget Lisa. What was he thinking, the way he treated her? It's a powerful scene, perhaps one of the most powerful that it's about verbal torture. Read that scene again and then pretend you're Lisa and feel what this guy's telling you. Holy crap. Respect yourself and others plays a large role in this novel. When you ask who has respect for whom, you're going to come up pretty short. For example, consider the following. But of course, that is because I do not respect myself. Can a man of perception respect himself at all? This is him writing. I do not respect myself. He says it. And then he says, well, I have perception. Can I respect ever do that? I was such an egoist, I was lacking in respect for my fellow creatures that I could not even imagine she would do so. Lisa. We shall not know what to join on to, what to cling to, what to love, what to hate, what to respect, and what to despise. We are oppressed at being men with real individual body, blood, and we are ashamed of it. And we think it's a disgrace and try to contrive of some sort of impossible generalized man. We are stillborn, and for generations past have been forgotten. Not by living fathers, and that suits us better and better, and we are developing a taste for it. And soon we're going to contrive to be born somehow from an idea. But enough, I don't want to write more from underground. This statement here, you should pause and read this again. This is pretty cool. This is what he's talking about. We don't know what to join on to, cling to. I don't know. This is belonging in Maslow. What to love. I don't know what to love, what to hate, what to respect. I don't know even. We're oppressed at being men. Is this guy a man? Of course he is, but what is a man? Men with real individual body and blood. We are ashamed of it. We think it's a disgrace. So we try to contrive some sort of impossible generalized man. He's a sad guy. Think about what's part of this chapter. As though of design, I used to get into trouble in cases when I was not to blame in any way. As though by design I would get into trouble in cases where I wasn't to blame. That was the nastiest part of it. And at the same time, so he was blamed for something he didn't do, I was generally touched and penitent. And I used to shed tears. And of course, I deceived myself, though I was not acting in the least. This was real to him. And there was a sick feeling in my heart at the time. For that one could not blame even the laws of nature, though the laws of nature have continually all my life offended me more than anything. It is lonesome to remember it all. But it was lonesome even then. What a sad case. So he would take the blame for something he didn't do and enjoy it. I would shed tears. And they were real to him. Holy cow. Who takes the blame for something they didn't do simply to act out remorse? Who does that? When my grandfather died, they used to, so you go to the wake, you go to the funeral home, and it was my step grandmother that he had his original wife, my mother's mother, died early when my mother was a young girl, like I think when she was 10. And so my father, because he had 9 children, 10 children, remarried again because he needed someone in those days to take care of the children. He worked in a foundry, actually a tannery, died of cancer. But anyway, he remarried again, and when my step-grandmother showed up at the funeral, She ran. I remember this vividly, like it was yesterday. I feel like the underground man. She ran to the coffin, and this was a small woman. She lifted my grandfather was a big guy, but at that time he had cancer, so he had lost a lot of weight. She lifted him from the coffin and was crying, "Tatush, Tatush, father, father." So and then they pulled her off and put him back in the casket. Afterwards, it was the custom to go and you go eat someplace at a restaurant, and I saw my step grandmother just prancing around like nothing happened, like nothing happened. She was just the toast of the town. It's another story. I can tell you why, But even then, I was observing, and I'm saying to myself, was that genuine emotion? Like, I felt bad. I used to watch wrestling with my grandfather. And I had a good time with him watching wrestling, and he never spoke English, just Polish. Oh, I revealed my identity. But you still don't know my name. Anyway, why am I telling you that story? Because that's what this guy is all about. What is his genuine emotion? Someone who rejects certainty, like Matthew, he just likes playing within his mind with events outside himself. He doesn't even like reality. That story I just told you about my step-grandmother was reality. I didn't make it up, I swear to God. But he's just playing in his own mind. He's the writer, director, producer, and the game of his life. Herman Hesse said, you can develop the game of your life. It lies in your hands. That's a very, very good quote. I'm surprised I didn't put it in here. But what a mess this guy is, isn't he? Or is he a mess? Is he happy in his unhappiness? Is it worse than watching a bad movie? This is actually a good movie, isn't it? Because we're inside a disturbed individual. Don't you want to help this guy? How would you help him? There's a great question. How would you help this guy? How often do you get a chance to get inside? Here's another insight. Of course, a minute or so later, I would realize wrathfully that it was all a lie, a revolting lie, an affected, pretend lie. It was all this penitence, this emotion, these vows of reform. You will ask, why did I worry myself with such antics? And the answer was, because it was very dull to sit with your hands folded, and so one began cutting capers. That's really it. He was bored. He was bored. Were you ever bored? I was only bored once in my life when I tested pinball machines at a factory. My dad got me a job in Chicago with the aldermen at a very famous place, Bally's. They used to make pinball machines. Well, Jimmy, that sounds like fun. Well, try testing it. Try testing pinball machines for 8 hours a day. Try it. Try it. That was the only job that I ever quit ahead of time. I was in college at the time, working in the summer. I couldn't take it. I quit 3 weeks early. I was going crazy. He's entertaining himself with his behavior as though he continually watches himself. Consider, there's a saying in baseball that the harder the pitcher tries to hit the strike zone, the more likely he will hit the batter. In other words, the pitcher has to throw naturally, without thought. Think about that. That's central to the book. This guy is not natural. The dinner party was natural. Lisa is natural. Actions. When you act, you're not thinking. You're acting. And when you are thinking, you're not acting. You may think before you act or after you act, but the act of acting is just that. It's an action, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Jimmy, don't speak the obvious, right? Well, it's different than thinking because they are yet interconnected processes that govern how all of us behave. I wrote that. Isn't that nice? Like the pitcher example, he doesn't think. He doesn't try. He just throws, right? Because he's already thought he's practiced, so he just executes. He just executes. And the difference lies in the internal thought versus the external execution. You're thinking, you execute. Thinking, But the relationship between action and thinking is more complicated, and it's the difference between reality and illusion. When you're thinking, when we are analyzing, feeling, reasoning, right? No one sees that. No one sees. I have a saying, when you call up and when we do research on a phone and you connect with somebody, you have no idea what that person's going through. None. I was writing the obituary for a president of $100 million, many million $100. It's like a $500 million company. His wife died. I was helping him write the obituary of his wife, and it gets a call from somebody trying to sell him uniforms for his factory. And the president of the company, he answered the phone, hello. Yeah. The guy at the other end should have took it from the way he answered the phone that the guy's obviously under stress, but he didn't take it. It's a long story. No one sees your thoughts, but they see your actions. They can see your reactions, your facial expressions, your hand gestures, your lack of focus. They can see it. Observation is the key to life. It is. So take the slap in the face from the narrator's point of view. A slap in the face is an action, right? He wants to get thrown through the window in the billiard room. And your response to a slap may be immediate. You slap back or you don't. In a couple of instances, the narrator wants to get slapped in order, but in reality, nothing like that happens. You remember when he's stalking, right? He's stalking the guy. Thinking occurs within the mind, and often without others knowing about it unless it's expressed with some type of action. I'm going to pause for one more second too, please. I'm back. That was a short one, right? But in reality, nothing happens. Remember, we were stalking for a long time. He wants to just bump the officer. We're going to talk about that. So when the narrator sweats, right, he reacts to what is going on in his head. Remember when he sweats or he turns red, he turns crimson? Have you said, what are you thinking about when you notice a person you're talking to is drifting off? Do you drift off? Or do you concentrate? Do you look at the person? He doesn't look at people. So thinking can be reasoning about anything, your life, ethics, or in this case, the whole part of number one was his thinking about free will versus reason versus logic, right? He's continually thinking and thinking and thinking and writing down his thoughts until it drives us crazy. Scenarios in his mind, what if scenarios. Even when he's narrating to Lisa, they're all the result of his thinking. And don't forget, he says he reads a lot. Well, can we say he thinks too much? I would say perhaps, because when you think too much, you may get somewhat paralyzed. So acting, on the other hand, refers to the processes of executing decisions like behavior. Unlike thinking, which remains theoretical and tangible, acting brings ideas to reality, right? They become tangible. You turn red. You slap somebody. You get slapped. Right? You take a walk, your walk. Like the time the narrator walked into the billiard room. He wanted to get nothing happen except the officer picked him up. Remember how small he must be. He picks him up and moves him to the side, which ticks this narrator off tremendously. So movements, speech, behaviors that can be seen, may be measured. Think about the scene when he was with his friends where he paced up and back for hours. Hours, right? Hours. It's his diary. He's telling himself. Why does he tell himself that? Why did he describe it so vividly? Thinking and actions always lead to real consequences, immediate, long-term, tangible, and intangible. You can think all you want, but unless you put your thoughts into actions, who's going to ever know what the hell you're thinking about? Like this, what I'm doing now. I've thought a lot about this book, right? And now I'm putting it into action. I'm reading it with you. I've analyzed it. I want you to think about what I'm saying. And I want to think about what you're saying. So email me, Jimmy at Reading with Jimmy. We don't have glass heads. Sometimes I wish we did, and sometimes I wish we didn't. The fact is, This narrator can't really get outside of his head, and for a very long has a profound impact not only on his behavior, but on the other people around him. And this is true of everyone. But telling people what's inside your head can be dangerous, huh? It makes you vulnerable. I love you. When you say that, I love you, it makes you very vulnerable, doesn't it? If someone says it to you and you don't say it back, what does that mean? Well, or you're like listening into conversations that people have when no one is listening. Sometimes the truth comes out. Did you ever make a phone call and the other person didn't hang up and you didn't either, but they don't know you're on the phone? Very interesting. And truth hurts sometimes, doesn't it? I remember a client one time, the CEO was blaming me and two other employees for a crappy outcome of a video we produced over his product. Over and over and over again, he kept belittling his employees and me about the result. It was horrible. And after taking it in for a bit, and knowing that the true employees wouldn't say anything, I objected verbally at first. I raised my hand and I said that, wait a minute, you approved the script, blah, blah, blah. And I explained the production details, what we went through to film this video. And this incensed, my explanation incensed him further. And his voice got louder and louder and erupted into a whole range of swearing. I don't remember. He was just swearing like a trooper. I stood up, true story, and yelled back. And I was about to walk to the front where he was when my client, who was sitting next to me that I traveled with, grabbed my arm and looked. I looked down and then I fell back immediately into reality. So I kept up my yelling instead, and I sat back down eventually instead of walking up, because obviously it would have come to blows. So on the airplane back to my office, I resolved never to do that again, lose my temper, and two, never go back if possible. But of course I had to go back. He was my client. But I never let the CEO's harassment get under my skin to the point of turning into action. And today we've become actually good friends. Don't ask me how that happened. Because I was ready to get the poop beat out of me because he was bigger. He was bigger than me. While different than the narrator's experience, the principle is the same. There is a big difference between thinking and acting. Emotion. Do you think the narrator is emotional? Yeah. Well, how could he not be from his writing? And I had a philosophy teacher who told us once, you have a given amount of emotional capital, don't waste it. Do you believe that? That you have a given amount of emotional capital and that you shouldn't waste it? I thought a long time if that was true, if you only have so much. Or is your emotional capital unlimited? What do you think? What is the narrator in this story spending his emotional capital on? What's he spending it on? Himself. Where do you spend your emotional capital? The point is that acting without thinking can lead to unintended consequences, just like thinking without acting has unintended consequences. So when I was about to confront the CEO, I was totally prepared, like I said, to get the poop beat out of me, but at least he would know he was in a fight. What goes on in our minds? I don't think I was thinking when I got up. I do that occasionally, and my wife says, "What were you thinking?" And I said, "I guess I wasn't." Sometimes it's a long story. What is the relationship between thinking and acting? Well, sometimes thinking leads to acting. In the narrator's case, when he was kept trying to confront the officer and finally bumped him, he thought about it a very long time before he did it, maybe too long. But you can see how he built up the entire motivation of the officer in his mind, which was no motivation at all, except that the officer never even noticed the narrator. Even at the just right for the confrontation. And I'm not going to read all this, but I confess that after many efforts, I began to despair. We simply couldn't run into each other. But then they did, right? I knew that what I was doing, I had stepped aside again. I even prayed as I approached them. One time I made up my mind. It ended my One time I had made up my mind thoroughly to bump into him, but it ended up in my stumbling and falling at his feet. At the very last instant, when I was 6 inches from my courage failed me, he was very calmly stepped over me while I flew on one side like a ball. But then he eventually bumps him, and he thinks that the officer was only pretending not to notice him, but I don't think the officer did notice him. What a guy, huh? And consider this scene from part 8. This is from the last reading. I will kill him! I will kill him! I shouted suddenly. He's with Lisa, striking the table with my fist so hard that the ink spurted out of the inkstand. What are you saying? She cried, jumping. I will kill, who's him? Apollon, the servant. I will kill him! I shrieked, suddenly striking the table in an absolute frenzy and at the same time fully understanding how stupid it was to be in such a frenzy. You see what I mean about watching himself? You don't know, Lisa, what a torturer is to me. What that torturer is to me. He is my torturer. He is gone now to fetch some rust. And suddenly I burst into tears. It was a hysterical attack. He worked himself into a frenzy, right? How ashamed I felt in the middle of my sobs, but still, I couldn't restrain them. Do you know what he just did when, it was the 7 rubles, right? That story. Who's the torturer? Who's the torturer? Is Apollon the torturer? I don't think so. Is he acting? Is he sincere? Fully understanding how stupid it was? Boy, oh boy. But sometimes acting leads to thinking. In Notes from Underground, any action by this narrator leads to thoughts in his head. Any action, the smallest. Remember his entirely made-up story about his servant, Apollon, and how he was going to withhold his pay to prove a point. What point? He owed Apollon money, so no wonder Apollon thought he was crazy. But sometimes thinking and acting can go into conflict. And this is surely the case with our narrator. He thinks way too much. And unfortunately, he just can't seem to let go. Thinking is about possibilities. For example, I could jump off a roof safely. I think I can jump off a roof safely. But acting is about reality. I jumped off the roof and I broke my leg. You see the difference? Thinking happens in your mind. Acting happens in the world. Great thinkers may never act. And great actors may never think, but the most effective people are balancing both. And Aristotle was right, the golden mean. Some additional observations, and I'm not going to go through all of these. Observe yourself more carefully, gentlemen, then you will understand this is so. I invented adventures for myself and made up life, so at least to live in some way. How many times it has happened to me, well, for instance, to take offense simply on purpose. So he knows what he's doing. He knows himself very well. Another time, twice, in fact, I tried hard to be in love. I suffered too, gentlemen, I assure you. In the depths of my heart, there was no faith in my suffering. Blah, 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 right? I was jealous besides myself, etc. Gentlemen. And you should read this. Pause me and read this. He tried to be in love. You don't try to be in love. You either fall in love or you don't. There's no such thing as trying, right? Remember the pitcher analogy. The more you try, the more you're going to hit the batter. The book ends with the narrator's assertion that we, modern men, have lost the ability to act decisively. This is the ending. I want to read all of this, but boy, we've been here a long time. Even now, so many years later, all of this is somehow an evil memory. I have many evil memories, but hadn't I better end my notes here? I believe I made a mistake in beginning to write them. Anyway, I have felt ashamed all this time. I've been writing this story. So it's hardly literature so much as a corrective punishment. Writing is therapeutic. Why to tell long stories showing how I have spoiled my life through morally rotting in my corner? Tell me this guy doesn't know himself through lack of fitting environment, through divorce from real life, and rankling spite in my underground world would certainly not be interesting. A novel needs a hero, and all of the traits for an anti-hero are expressly gathered together here. And what matters most, it all produces an unpleasant impression, for we are all divorced from life. Is that true? We are all cripples, every one of us, more or less. We are so divorced from life that we feel at once a sort of loathing for real life, and so we cannot bear and be reminded of it. Why, we've almost come looking upon real life as an effort, almost as hard work, and we are all privately agreed that it's better in books. And why do we fuss and fume sometimes? Why are we perverse and then we ask for something? Why don't we know ourselves? What we don't know what ourselves. It would be worse for us to be petulant prayers were answered. Come, try, give any one of us a little more independence, untie our hands, widen the spheres of our activity, relax control, and yes, I assure you, we would be begging to be under control again. At once. I know that you will never likely be angry at me for that, and will certainly be shouting and stamping. Speak for yourself as for what concerns me in particular. I have only in my life carried to an extreme what you have not dared to carry halfway. And what's more, you have taken for your cowardice for good sense and have found comfort in deceiving yourself, so that perhaps after all, there is more life in me than there is in you. What do you think? Look more carefully. We don't even know what living means. Leave us alone without books, and we'll be lost in confusion. We shall know what to join onto, what to cling. We shall not know what to join, cling to, love. We are oppressed. See, this guy's depressed, isn't he? What to hate? We are oppressed at being men with real individual body and blood. We read that, right? But enough. I don't want to write anymore from underground. And he stops. You read and you say, this guy's crazy. Well, you can read that and you can ask yourself and conclude that. But I'm telling you right now, he's not. He may be depressed. He may be sad. Maybe a little off, but we're all a little off, because this reminds me that Joseph Conrad's quote comes to my mind. Because we do all live in our heads, don't we? A man is much more like the sea, whose movements are too complicated to explain, and whose depths may bring up God only knows what at any moment. You've been analyzing Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is Jimmy. You can email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy@reading with your questions, comments, interpretations. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly do. I won't sleep tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and I thank you so much for your time. I'm going to continue exploring classics on my website. Please come there often and read them with me. And remember, if you got any suggestions you want me to read, please send them over, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. And as Marcus Aurelius says, those who do not observe the movements of their own minds must of necessity be unhappy. Good luck.